Welcome, Oliver. Thank you so much for joining me on the Calm You podcast. How are you doing today?
Thanks for inviting me. I'm doing pretty well. Yeah. How about
Good,
you?
good. Yeah, really good actually. Good. I'm very excited for this. I think your previous book to this one, 4,000 Weeks, was a book that I recommended to so many people, so many of my
Fantastic.
clients. When I was listening to it, I had it on audiobook and I just thought, wow, this person really needs this message. So I'm very, very excited to speak to you about your latest book, which is Meditations for Mortals. Can you share a bit about how you came to write this book and a little bit about your kind of, yeah, how you came to get to where you are today?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this book did grow out of the last one, 4,000 Weeks, and it definitely, at the broadest level, the themes are still, dealing with being a finite human. I think I've sort of broadened it out to be more about the many different ways in which we're limited, not just in terms of the quantity of time that we have, but the amount of control we have, the amount of understanding we can never really fully achieve about other people, and all the rest of that. And then also sort of narrowed it down in a different way, because this book is intended to really be about taking action on a daily day-to-day level. So it's structured as sort of 4 weeks of short daily chapters, and obviously I can't force people to read it in any particular way, but the sort of suggestion is that you could approach it that way, right? To sort of get a little bit of these perspective shifts about sort of coming back down to earth and being more fully sort of in conscious of one's limitations on a day-to-day basis. And again, well, not again, but I make a habit of pointing out at this point, maybe, um, not because we should just, there's some inherent virtue in facing the truth about how limited we are, but because it really is, I think, the portal to a way of life that is both calmer and more peaceful and more productive and meaningful. I think you do get more done by recognizing the limitations on what you can get done.
Mm. Yeah, and I love the way the book is suggested to read a sort of a little chapter every day for 4 weeks, and how it's just about letting the ideas kind of settle into your mind and take root, and hopefully really start to shift how you think about things. I'd love to know. So all the people listening to this podcast basically have some form of anxiety, and I really think that this book is kind of exactly the message that we need to hear for the kind of anxious times that we live in,
Mm-hmm.
and whether it's a real anxiety disorder that someone has, or just the kind of general sense of pressure, not enoughness,
Yeah.
feeling behind that so many of us are experiencing. I'd love to know what are your thoughts on why we are so anxious, in this day and age.
I mean, there's so many layers to this, right? And me too. I mean, not necessarily. We can get into. I don't have a diagnosis, so I don't want to sort of offend people who do by sort of jumping on a bandwagon. But anxiety is a totally central part. What I would call anxiety, a totally central part of my sort of experience of the world, and very central to what I think I'm trying to do in this book. As for why, I mean, I think there are all these different layers of explanation. How we're parented, the fact that we live in times that do seem especially anxiety inducing, the economic and cultural systems that we live under that make it feel like you actually really have to do more than you can just in order to stay afloat. um, I could go further back and talk about how I think the era of industrialization played a role here. I think what it all adds up to, certainly in my understanding of the kind of anxiety that I'm sort of that's relevant maybe to what I'm talking about, is that it feels like in one way or another we're trying to get to some place where we have our lives sorted out, or we're on top of everything, or we finally know what we're doing in our jobs or as parents or as spouses. And you sort of, it's that sort of fantasy of one day getting to a point where you're sort of secure and in control. You know what's coming. You don't need to worry about the future and all the rest of it. And I think that actually that is a fantasy, right? That we're not going to get to that place, and that real relief from anxiety comes from seeing just how irredeemably we are stuck in this situation of not being able to know things not being able to get a handle on things, never feeling like we're ready for things. So I think that sort of, we can talk about this more if you want or not if you don't, but that sort of, that idea about seeing the ways in which our situation is worse than we think and how that's actually really liberating is very important to me. That sort of sense about, like, you feel anxious because you don't feel that the world is as predictable as you want it to be. Well, actually, the world really isn't as predictable as you want it to be, and it's not your fault. It's not because you haven't worried enough yet or made enough plans. It's just the way it is. Um, there's something about that message that for me is just so relaxing. So we can talk more about that if you want, but that's where I'm coming from here.
Yeah, yeah, I did find that interesting in the book. I think it's right at the beginning where you're saying, yeah, we're not in control. We're looking for this sense of control and to try and perfect things or try and find the perfect productivity method so that we can get everything done that we need to. And actually, those things are kind of useless to try and even pursue them because that's just not the reality that we live in. And
I
I
think
love
a lot of us.
the
Sorry,
word you. Oh, sorry, I was going to say a lot. I love the word you use, imperfectionism. Um, and yeah, I wondered if you could share a bit about that.
this is just my umbrella term because you've got to have a proprietary label, right, for the things that you're saying, and this is my label for this whole approach to life that takes it, that starts from that sort of defeat, as it were, that starts by saying there's always going to be too much to do. That's the nature of being a finite human. There's always going to be more to other people than you can hope to fully understand. It's always going to feel like you're unready to do new and interesting things, almost by definition, right? Because they're new to you, um, and that can be the ground for moving forward, not a sort of terrible defeat that you just have to depressingly deal with, but a sort of, that can be the starting point for really sort of living, showing up for life much more actively and much more constructively and productively, because you're no longer trying to sort of you're no longer putting off life to that point in the future when you're finally in control. You're just right here in the thick of the mess, and it's actually possible, I think, to do it in a state of great calm. I think that's what I mean by imperfectionism.
Mm. Yeah, I really noticed that, but both in myself and in people that I talk to, this sense of like if we make a mistake, it's like something's gone wrong and I shouldn't be making mistakes. I should be getting it right the first time, or I should be successful or not be, annoying people or having arguments. And it's is this kind of weird perfectionism that we have. I notice this in myself, like beating myself for that up for that when really it's normal to make a mistake, to do things imperfectly, to find things hard if you're doing them for the first time. And it would be weird if you just were kind of breezing through things. I don't think anyone experiences that.
Right, and on some, I mean, it would be weird, and on some level, it's just completely out of the question because we are these kind of limited material animals who also have minds that can conceive of uh, sort of unlimited things. So you can always imagine that a piece of creative work you were setting out to do could be perfectly easy, reach a perfectly high standard, be celebrated by millions of people, right? You can always go there in your mind. You can always go in your mind to the idea that, everybody around you, it's your responsibility to keep everyone around you's emotions upbeat and happy. Uh, but all of these things are, and there's 10 other examples I could give, but all of them uh, are out of step with the reality that we're in, which is that the moment you put pen to paper with a piece of writing or brush to canvas with a painting, you're automatically falling short of um, that perfect standard. If falling short is even a meaningful term, given that everyone by definition has to fall short, and so it's really just a sort of, it's an exploration in what happens when you kind of put down that heavy and possibly heavy burden of trying. The problem is making the minimum standard at which you're going to feel that you've done an acceptable job actually beyond the maximum that any human could reach. Right? That's a that's a way of living that pretty much guarantees that you're going to feel frustrated and worried and tense and all the rest of it because you're trying to sort of get out of the human condition, even.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and having spoken to a lot of authors and things, on this podcast, I would say the majority of them will talk about how hard it is writing, those ups
Hmm.
and downs of being creative, and, some people say, yeah, that they can never write a book, but actually, yeah, it is a big struggle for, I think, lots of us, and actually that's normal. I think, to find it
There's
really
this,
easy, you'd be very rare.
no, absolutely, and we put these labels on things, right? We come up with the notion of writer's block as if it's a terrible affliction and an unusual affliction that you should feel bad about to not know how to take the next step in a piece of writing. That's just the feeling of writing, um, and I don't want this to come off as too much like tough love, like just get over it and get on with it. I don't think it is. I don't think it is very tough actually at all. I think that being kind and friendly to yourself is a really important part of it. But it is about not um, holding yourself relentlessly and sort of aggressively to standards that nobody could ever meet. Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of, thinking about imposter syndrome, whereby it's called a syndrome as if it's some kind of illness or something. But actually, when you survey people, anywhere between 50 and 90%, depending on it's men or women or different industries in work, will experience imposter syndrome. And perhaps that's maybe just part of the human condition rather than a sort of an illness to be solved somehow.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are, I think the population maybe divides into three, right? And on the one hand, yes, there are a few people who are completely confident they know what they're doing. And they're usually a disaster, and you want to steer clear of them. But basically, the rest of us fall into two camps, right? One camp don't really know what they're doing and feel like they're winging it the whole time, and uh, have a big problem with that and feel bad, like they're inadequate. And the other camp also feel like they're winging it all the time and don't know what they're doing, but they've come to understand that that's sort of in the nature of doing interesting things with your life. And I've noticed this transition in myself, really. I mean, the more that I've done this kind of writing and talking about my writing and, you know, appearing in public at events and things, I, I'm certainly not, you know, totally perfect at this. And it would be maybe hypocritical of me if I claimed to be. But, you know, more and more I'm used to the fact that a kind of a new kind of venue or a new kind of format or a new set of questions are going to feel like I don't really know what I'm supposed to be doing. And that's kind of fine. And actually, I think, more creative stuff comes from embracing that not knowing. But the only way to never feel that would be to only do exactly the same things in your life day after day.
Mm. Yeah, I do find it interesting how quite often when you talk to people that are doing sort of, things where they're putting themselves out there in the world, we look at them and we think that person has got it all together. They know what they're
Mm-hmm.
doing. They don't get nervous. They just trust themselves. And you speak to them and you hear, actually, yeah, there is that self doubt there. There is maybe they don't sleep that well the night before. Or they do get stressed. And actually, I think again, yeah, it's about acknowledging that reality and
Mm-hmm.
letting those feelings be there without making yourself wrong for them or telling yourself it's because you haven't found the right technique to banish any imposter syndrome or nerves.
Right, and again, this is one example of something that I think comes up again and again through my writing, but not only there. And it's really one of the things that really has drawn me to the Zen tradition specifically. Time and again, we think the problem is that we haven't found a way to solve life, basically. And actually, the problem, if there is one, is thinking that there ought to be a way to solve life. So there's these wonderful quotations you come across like the one from the American Buddhist teacher Mel Weitzman, who says, "Our suffering is believing there's a way out." Because as long as you think there's a way out of this situation, the fact that you haven't found it and got through to those sunlit uplands of beautiful perfection, that's a problem. But when you realize that there isn't one, that's when you can really get your hands dirty with the in the present, I think.
Love that. Yeah, yeah. Another sort of theme that you talk about in the book, and again, this is another thing that I experience, um, the kind of the sense that we are behind in life, that we need to catch up, that we haven't ticked everything off, maybe by a certain age, or maybe we compare ourselves with other people, and then we find ourselves in this state of always being busy and always being, yeah, just there's too many things to do and not enough time.
Mhm.
What do you have to say to sort of people experiencing that?
I mean, I don't want to be glib about it because I feel it too very often. And I've had this sort of ironic situation where the last book I wrote did sort of better than I was expecting. So I wrote a whole book about overwhelm and then got kind of more overwhelmed as a result of it spreading far and wide. So I constantly have to struggle with this at a new depth or new level. But um, I think the place to begin, nonetheless, is just to point out um, again that there will always be millions more, perhaps infinitely more things that you could meaningfully and usefully do with your time than you will be able to do. The feeling of overwhelm is this feeling that there's more that you must do in a given time period than you can or than you think you can. But actually, just to get sort of philosophical for a moment, that doesn't make any sense. It can't be the case that you must do more than you can do. That idea just doesn't work. You will do what you can do. And if there are bad consequences to that, because you have a tyrannical boss who expects you to answer 100 emails in an hour when you can only answer 20 in an hour, then whatever happens as a result of that will happen. And it might be bad. I understand that. It's definitely an easier thing to say than to live through. But it's always the case that all you can ever do is pick a few things from the infinite menu of things that you could do with the next couple of hours of the afternoon or whatever it is, and do them. Make that decision on the basis of the best intuitions you have. You know, things you've agreed to do, deadlines you face that are important to you to meet, whatever the criteria are. It's never going to be a question of getting through the infinite supply. And as I say, I find that really relaxing because it means that I can stop doing this impossible thing or stop trying to do this impossible thing and instead take real satisfaction in the sense that I did like 7 interesting, useful things today instead of trying and failing to do 700.
Mm, yeah. I love, you talk about this idea of the productivity debt and the done list in the book. And this resonated a lot with me because I know it doesn't matter what job you do, but I think coming from a perspective of someone that works for themselves and kind of runs a business,
Mm-hmm.
there is like an endless number of things you could do. You could easily work from the moment you wake up in the morning till midnight, and still it's never going to be done. You know, there's no
Right.
one telling you, "Oh, you've done all your work now,"
Yeah.
um, and so it can be really easy to sort of to wake up in the morning, I think, and just have this sense that, like, I know you do talk about it in the book, this kind of we have to, I don't know whether you say we have to sort of earn our rest or be productive to feel like we can kind of justify our existence almost.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. And it's like, obviously, this feeling of productivity debt, when I sort of, I don't know if other people had coined it too, but when I coined it again, people really sort of, it resonated with people because there is this sense that you sort of wake up in the morning and unless you can get back to zero balance in the productivity bank account by sort of doing enough work, that you haven't really earned your right, yeah, as you say, to exist on the planet. Obviously, on some level, we are in productivity debt, especially if you're in a salaried or wage paid position. You do owe your employer some work, but I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about this much deeper kind of self worth issue that says if I didn't do a lot of stuff today, like I don't really get to be here. There's not that feeling that like, oh, I'm alive, that's enough. I'm acceptable because I'm alive. And then if I do some stuff to earn some money, great, that's better. And it would be ideal, wouldn't it, if I could pay the rent and buy groceries. But it's not central to my fundamental sort of justification of my existence. And so the idea of the done list, which is pretty well known at this point, and my version of it is just literally a list where you add things onto it as you complete them during the day, and it gets longer during the day. which to-do lists often tend to as well, but that's a problem when they get longer. The done list getting longer is a good thing. And it just serves as a record and a reminder to yourself that, you know, you've done a bunch of things. You're not only looking at the infinite list of things you have yet to do, which is it's infinite. You're comparing your productivity to that is never going to result in a sort of happy judgment because it's infinite. But it has this
Mm.
sort of counterweight, and it also just sort of, on a more subtle level, it kind of reminds you that um, I can't even quite express this in words necessarily, but it has this sense of like um, shifting your focus onto the ways in which you're engaging with reality by doing the things that you have done today, as compared to what you would have done if you just stayed in bed and done nothing. Instead of constantly comparing to fantasy, which is where the sort of list of uncompleted tasks lives. So it's very grounding and in a way that I find very, very beneficial.
Yeah, I love that. It kind of reminds me of the thing of celebrating small wins. I think this comes from Stanford, where they
Yeah.
studied people who noticed the ways that they were moving things forwards and kind of celebrated them, even
Yeah.
little small things, and how that really made people happier and made them more motivated and just kind of um, yeah, more productive. I think to sort of focus on those things.
Yeah, certainly. I think the small wins is a great sort of framing for the same basic idea, which is just like sort of to notice that you're in reality and not to completely drive yourself crazy making comparisons to like the place that you're not, the fantasy of having it all done and getting there. Because I mean, I'm not a sort of I'm definitely not an expert on anxiety and its sort of medical meanings, but to me, something that's central about anxiety is that it has like an implicit endpoint, right? It's like it's an attempt to get to a place through worry, through changing your environment, whatever. Like there's something in it that needs something to change in order to get. And if the place that you're trying to get is just not a place that humans can get, then on the one hand, it's a unhappy way to live, but on the other hand, it's easier to let go of that than if it was possible, right? Because at some point, I think you can stop beating yourself up for not doing something that nobody could ever do.
Mm, mm. Yeah, that is a relaxing thought, actually, to just reframe it in that way. I really wanted to ask you something about, again, another theme in the book, which is you talk about staying sane when the world is a mess.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, I think that, has the world has gotten more messy in the last few years and it doesn't really show any signs of changing. I think things are probably going to get messier before they get better. And one of the things you talked about that really struck me was actually that we're invited to care more about human suffering than the greatest saints of the past would have done in their whole lives. And actually, that's
Mm.
true. We only have to open the news or social media to see so much suffering going on. How do we, yeah, stay sane or not be just depressed and miserable, kind of crying every time we open our device to sort of look at things?
It's such a challenge. And as you say, I think, a big part of it is to do with the internet and digital communication, but it often feels these days, I think, like the news is more sort of the stakes are more personal than at many times in history for most people. Obviously, in the middle of World War I and World War II, the stakes were incredibly high for whole populations and people fighting or with relatives. That kind of thing has happened all the way through history. But there is this sort of sense now that there's nobody who can just sort of forget that the things are happening that are happening, even though they, in by most judgments, have much less need most of the time need and provoke less anxiety than world wars. Um, and I think that one of the things that's really important to see there is that we live in this attention based economy now where everyone who's communicating this information, even very honorable people. I'm not talking about just like fake news merchants, but good media organizations and humanitarian groups that are trying to make the world a better place. They all have this unavoidable incentive to sort of up the ante in terms of how bad things are and how important it is for you to do something about it, or at the very least to feel bad about it, because that's just the environment in which they promote their their messages. And so I think one consequence of this is that we have to start seeing that that being a good citizen doesn't just involve paying attention to things outside your own life. It does, but also the willingness to sort of withdraw your attention, which is another aspect of how finite we all are, so that you can make a difference in some other area, right? So I make a big case in the book for saying pick your battles, right? If you understand this about the attention economy, maybe you can give yourself permission to say, look, I'm not going to focus on or give money to or volunteer to help in these 6 areas, even though they really matter. Not because I've convinced myself they don't really matter. They do. It's just that I'm going to focus on this 7th area instead, and concentrate my uh, compassion there where it can really have an impact. And then, of course, when you feel like you're doing something because you're volunteering with some local group that is changing somebody else's life slightly for the better, or you're, you know, able to give a bit more of a significant amount of money to a cause because you're not giving tiny direct debits that you got slightly hijacked into giving in the street to 10 different causes. There's a real benefit for your own sense of efficacy there. And just one other thing to add there, I think that the same issue we've been talking about sort of waiting until you're on top of things or you feel like you know what you're doing, people also are quite prone to kind of waiting until the world calms down to get involved in stuff, or even just to have fun, right? I think we shouldn't feel guilty as long as we are paying some attention to the wider world and doing what we can as citizens. I don't think we should feel guilty for also doing things that are just purely enjoyable. The comparison that always resonates with me is like with in medieval times. It would have been completely ridiculous for a medieval peasant to think to themselves, well, I'm going to wait until we really understand the causes of plague and famine, or be certain there isn't going to be like a attack by marauding tribes from another country in the next 6 months. And until then, we can't possibly have festivals where everyone, gets drunk and dances. Those things just had to happen right there in the middle of all this suffering. And I think it's ultimately still true today, even though it's easy to forget.
Yeah, as you were talking about that, I did notice a thought in my mind of kind of, yeah, will I allow myself to be okay when climate change is solved? That's probably not going to happen in my lifetime, so I need to kind of try and find more peace with it. And I do love that idea of choosing, yeah, maybe one cause to put your attention into. So maybe it is climate change or the situation in Congo or whatever it might be, and putting your energy into that, and you're going to feel like you're making more of a difference, and you're not going to get so overwhelmed by everything that maybe you just have to disengage because you end up burning out or you get kind of compassion fatigue or something.
Absolutely. And you don't, and I think this is crucial for sort of guilt prone people, which is definitely people who care about all this stuff. You don't make things worse or by not having a party, right? You don't make things worse by having a party. You don't keep crises from getting worse by denying yourself pleasures. I mean, at the margins, maybe you shouldn't be chartering private jets to go on parties while also fighting climate change. But you know what I mean? It's like you don't. There's this sense that like, oh, I've got to deny myself anything good in life as some sort of act of solidarity for the fact that there are bad things happening in the world. But that just reduces the some quantity of joy in the world. It doesn't actually help the cause that you care about.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. One question that I always ask guests is, what is one thing that you are struggling with at the moment, and how are you kind of working through it or dealing with it, or yeah, what's your kind of process with that?
I mean, like I struggle with so many things, and it's just kind of a lovely thing that I get to sort of pursue those struggles and find routes through them and then write about it as a job. Um, so, kind of everything we've discussed could be an answer to that question. Um, the one I'll pick, because it's really feeling central to me right now, and I'm trying to write a newsletter about it actually, is um, the sort of strange challenge of being willing to be unproductive sometimes, and how genuinely difficult I apparently find it to stop and walk away and go and do something that has no um, sort of goal oriented purpose at all. So the things I always think about here in my case, like going on a hike. We live in the beautiful part of the North York Moors where there's no excuse for not going on great hikes, and or reading, but not reading for work, not reading for self improvement, just reading books for pure pleasure. It's like there's something very useful I'm finding and not comfortable in almost obliging myself to do this, right? Almost saying, okay, I'm going to work for this period of time, but at the end of it, I'm going to stop working, even if I feel like I'm on a roll, even if I feel like I really want to power through. Because a lot of that powering through is basically anxiety fueled. It's basically the idea that with one last heave, I could get on top of all my to dos, and then it doesn't happen, and then you feel bad about yourself. So actually, really training that muscle of being willing to not be doing productive things is is very difficult for me, but very rewarding as well. Rewarding, for example, in terms of like being with my family. And I have this terrible, slightly workaholic tendency to, in the back of my mind, think that if I'm not working, it's not quite the best use of my time, which is a disastrous way to be a parent, for example. Um, and that's something I'm really working on through this kind of almost enforced non-productivity. It sounds a little bit privileged on some level to be able to talk about this. I recognize that it's lovely to be able to choose to spend 2 hours of a day not working, but not the easy thing you might assume it was.
Definitely. Yeah, I relate to that as well. I think I can sometimes get into this overwhelmed state where I'm looking at my to-do list again and again, trying to work on something, but because my brain is not focused and it's just overloaded, I go back to the to-do list and then I click through some browsers and kind of get distracted by different things. And actually, what I need to do in that moment is step away and go
Yeah,
and have a nap or something, or go and have a walk. But it
right.
does seem like it can be really hard to do that. And yeah,
I think an amazing trick. Sorry, I was butting in, but like an amazing trick is just to remember as you set off on that walk that it's not going to feel great at the first moment, right? Or when you open the novel. This has been the biggest revelations for me. It's like it can be I'm not saying people should force themselves to spend hours doing things they hate. That's a different problem, one I also have on some level probably, but it's that sort of, if there's something brings you a sense of liveliness and relaxation, like be patient for the first few minutes of doing it when it feels like you don't really want to be doing it because you'd rather be back ticking things off a list. Yeah.
yeah. And one thing, and I don't think this is the right approach, but sometimes I'll say to myself, this is actually productive to go and have a nap because it's then going to mean that I'm more productive later. But actually, that's probably more of the same mindset. And we probably need to, yeah, think that we don't need to be
Whatever gets you to
productive.
the nap is probably worth it. But no, I do
Yeah.
notice one thing I had to be careful of as I was sort of training myself recently to sort of practice being non-productive is it's like it's no good getting up from the desk and the email inbox if the first thing I go and do is work on the long-term project of cleaning out the garage, right? That's still productivity by another sailing under a different flag.
Mm, mm. There was one last thing that I wanted to ask, and it's just about being able to do the things that matter to you. So I had a situation recently where I wanted to get back into reading. I don't know why. Like after having a child 2 years ago, I was always too tired to read. I was just watching TV or something. And just being able to read every day, which is a habit I used to love, just seemed like the hardest thing in the world to
Mhm.
be able to do. Um, why? And I know this is such a common issue for people, that actually doing the things that we know we should do, it might be drinking more water, it might be exercising, it might be meditating. Sometimes it feels like like almost impossible for us to actually just do them. And I don't know what
Mhm.
suggestions you might have for someone experiencing that, and for me.
Well, I really know what you mean. I think part of what I just said is maybe relevant here, right? Don't I'm not suggesting people do a lot of things they know in their guts are wrong for them, but also like be willing to ride out discomfort. So if you want to get back into reading, you might have to spend a 45-minute period reading where the first 20 of them feel all sort of antsy and off somehow, like wearing sort of ill-fitting clothes. So I think that's important. And then the other thing which I do come back to quite a bit in the book is to sort of relax a little bit the tendency that we have, especially these days, I think, to think in terms of building a new habit, right? It's like, don't weigh yourself down with the idea that you're going to drink X number of liters of water every day for the rest of your life. Because there are all sorts of reasons why that's actually a sort of daunting thing, even though it's just drinking water. Um, and the same with reading, right? You sort of think to yourself, well, my life doesn't allow me to spend an hour reading every single day at the moment. So, like, what's the point? Or it's going to be a big fight or a big struggle. Focus instead, if you can, on just doing the thing once, like literally just once. If you enjoy reading, you'll have used your life slightly better if you spend a couple of hours reading, even if you never do it again, right? I mean, if it's good to drink water, then drinking a bunch of water today is a great thing to do, even if you don't hydrate properly for the next 2 years, right? So I think it's really important to sort of let yourself do something once without it necessarily being part of a big structure of personality change. And of course, the irony is that you can end up implementing quite big personality changes that way, but but not from this perspective of like, okay, what I've got to do now is always this every day or 5 times a week uh, for the rest of my life.
Yeah, so I think if you think about it in terms of the rest of your life, it feels heavy because you can see your future in
Yeah,
this having to go to the gym 3 times a week for, like, the next 30 years or something. That feels quite
right.
overwhelming, but actually just saying, like, what can I do today? What can I do
And
for
not to
15
devalue it
minutes
just
or
because it's a
something?
one-off, right? It's good. It's good in itself.
Mm, mm, mm. Yeah, yeah. Oh, I do feel quite, relaxed talking to you, and, yeah, definitely recommend people check out your book. Where can people find out more about you, and yeah, anything you want to share finally with people about where they can get your book, or anything you like to signpost them to?
Meditations for Mortals is available wherever you get your books. There's an audio version read by me. That's by far the best thing that someone who wanted to support my work could do. My website, oliverburkeman.com, has you can sign up for my newsletter there and find out some other stuff as well.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you so much for talking to me. That was so insightful.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you.